Okay, here we go. Again, good evening. We are thrilled to bring you an authority on the Declaration of Independence. Danielle Allen is director of both the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at Harvard Kennedy School and the Democratic Knowledge Project Learn at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is a political philosopher whose current research focuses on democracy renovation. How to reconnect citizens to civic power through education and institutional redesign. How to make political institutions more responsive, accountable, and participatory. And how to make public policy that supports democracy. She is perhaps best known for her acclaimed 2014 book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. So please join me in welcoming Danielle Allen.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I will say I spent yesterday evening at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia with a son of Tennessee, whom I think you all know, John Meacham. So it was a great pleasure to spend time with him. And he was, as usual, full of stories, including stories of Tennessee. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. It's also an honor to be a speaker for your group on the eve of the semi-quincentennial. It's a big day for America. I am grateful that you are taking a moment for stopping and reflecting. And I'm just honored to be able to share that reflection with you. So let me just introduce myself a little bit more fully. I have, to my own surprise, spent more than the last 25 years working on and thinking about the Declaration of Independence. When I say that out loud, I am then also stunned to recognize that that's 10% of the life of the nation. That then makes me realize that I've been alive for, more than a fifth of the life of the nation. It's really quite incredible, actually. And I think about my mother, who's been alive for a third of the life of the nation. We are really much younger than we think we are. I think about it in this way, and sort of in terms of our own lifespans and what percentage of the life of the nation that is. And I realize, well, right now we're just sort of like a pimply hormonal teenager. So no wonder it's really awful. Okay. And there's hope. There's hope. We can grow out of this state that we're currently in. So I want to share a bit of the story of how I have come to work on the Declaration of Independence for a quarter of a century. And then based on that, share with you what I've learned about its continuing relevance for our current moment and how it can help us think about some of the challenges we have in the present day. So I am a combination of Harvard prof, which you heard a little bit about, and democracy advocate. I work pretty intensely in many contexts outside the university as well as in it on trying to achieve a healthy democracy. That is an almost, I'll admit, obsessive focus that I come by super honestly. For starters, it's a matter of my basic family inheritance. On my dad's side, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. That was super dangerous work, as I'm sure you all understand. He was taking his life into his hands to secure the right to vote. And on my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. So I love to celebrate my great-granddad, who marched with suffragists on Boston Common in 1917. But then there's also my great-grandmother, who ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 1930s. So both sides of my family started with this view that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving. Empowerment means, of course, steering your own life in your private life. But then it also means steering together with others in our public lives to shape our communities collectively. That requires democracy. So I was really lucky as a young person. I grew up in a big extended family of people committed to the value of democracy. I basically took it for granted as a young person. But then I had my own crisis of confidence about our democracy as I was watching my own generation come up in the world. I've had incredible opportunities, tenured prof at a great university. It's like, forget Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. I will say being a tenured professor is the single most privileged role there is in this universe. So I'm very fortunate, and I feel that, and I recognize it every day. I also have a lot of cousins who are not on this planet any longer because of all the hard things that we wrestle with in our society, addiction and gun violence and incarceration. And it was really sort of watching my cousins come up in the world and seeing them become disconnected to our institutions that I began to have, more questions about how we were doing with our democracy and what we could do to make it healthier. But along that way in that journey, I also spent a lot of time thinking about education. And in particular, one of my cousins, my favorite baby cousin, ended up in prison at a young age, 15, on a first offense for some terrible actions. And he served his time. He served a lot of time. But while he was in prison, I spent a lot of time trying to help him get education and access that. And this was a time in California in the 90s where California was at its most severe with regard to punishment. And so education had been stripped out of the schools, or out of the prisons rather. And there's only vocational education. So I was trying really hard to get him, more of a liberal arts style education. Anyway, in the course of that, I myself was a junior professor at the University of Chicago, and I found myself with this amazing opportunity to help build a night course for low-income adults. This was a project that was uniting the Illinois Humanities Council and the University of Chicago. And the goal of this night program was to give low-income working adults who had fallen out of the educational system a sort of second chance, a way back in to try to rebuild their lives. Our commitment to them was that we were not going to compromise on the caliber of the education we were providing. We were not going to compromise on the quality of the pedagogy. But there was a real puzzle, because a lot of these night students, sometimes people like my cousin, had never finished high school, didn't have a GED. So how on earth were we going to do that? Hit our sort of usual high standards and also bring in folks who didn't have that background. Anyway, the decision we made, the sort of solution to our puzzle that we came to, was that we wouldn't compromise at all on the quality of the material we assigned, but we would compromise on the length of the texts that we assigned. And so for that truly instrumental reason, we started teaching the Declaration of Independence. It's only 1,337 words. So we knew nobody was going to complain that the reading was too long. And then I had the most explosive teaching experience of my career. So we assigned it in history, we assigned it in philosophy, we assigned it in literature, we assigned it in writing. And my ninth students responded so powerfully and so quickly to the text, a lot faster than my very well-prepared day students did. You see, my night students, they were all in that class because they wanted to change their lives. They had surveyed their circumstances and found them wanting, and they had decided to add school into juggling two jobs and childcare and public transit because they wanted to set off in a new direction. And that story of human agency, it's exactly the same as the story of human agency at the heart of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is fundamentally this story about people who diagnose what's going wrong around them, name some principles to guide them as they articulate a new direction, name the action steps for that direction, and then link arms and mutually pledge to each other to go ahead in that new direction. They say, when in the course of human events. And that is that moment of diagnosis when they're really describing what the world is like around them. And then they lay out the principles in that all-important second sentence about self-evident truths. So whereas my University of Chicago students, with their great, AP US history scores and education and everything, they were concerned about things like, well, when exactly was the Stamp Act passed? And precisely how many pounds of tea were dumped into Boston Harbor? They were sort of distracted by the facts of the history. My night students went straight to the core of the Declaration. Now, when that happened, when they did that and responded so powerfully, they gave me a great gift. I had always puzzled over something that Abraham Lincoln had said. And I couldn't, it was beautiful and evocative, but I couldn't quite make sense of it. Abraham Lincoln described the Declaration of Independence as a golden apple in a frame of silver. Now, you may recognize that image, that metaphor. It comes from Proverbs, where in Proverbs it said, the word of a wise man fitly spoken is like a golden apple in a frame of silver. And at some level, what this means is that the Declaration of Independence is really the beating heart of what we are trying to do as a society. And the Constitution is just the frame that holds that core element in place. But what I'd always puzzled about was, exactly what was the golden apple? What was it that Lincoln meant that needed to be held in place by the Constitution? My students, by understanding so quickly that the Declaration of Independence is this story about human agency and what we all share, all of us humans, as creatures with purposes, that's the golden apple. That's the core element that the Declaration gives us. It really is the core content of the all-important second sentence. So let me just remind you about that second sentence, and we'll reflect on it a little bit as we start to think about how the Declaration can be useful for us today. This is the sentence that, as you know, the beginning, behold these truths to be self-evident, that all people, I'm going to say all people for now, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. It's a beautiful sentence. You ask yourselves, I'm curious, how many people remembered it was that long? I often find people don't tend to remember it's that long, but it really is. It's what philosophers call a syllogism. It's got a set of premises that yield a self-evident conclusion, self-evident because it comes from the premises as a matter of logic. So premise one, people have rights. Premise two, we institute government to secure our rights. Conclusion, when government's not delivering on that, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. And the work of instituting new government consists of two things: laying the foundation on principles and organizing the powers of government. That's the work of citizenship. So there in that long, beautiful, eloquent sentence, you have that proposition that Lincoln invoked in the Gettysburg Address, the idea that this is a nation dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal, or all men are created equal, as he said in the Gettysburg Address. And the sentence spells out the implications of that equality. We are equal in this striving that we have, this pursuit of happiness. All of us are trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. That striving is a way we express our desire for freedom, that desire to steer our own lives in private, but then also to steer them together with others in public. And none of us can have that freedom unless we are all equally protected from domination by other people. So freedom and equality belong together hand in glove. They are mutually reinforcing concepts. And that beautiful sentence with that idea that we're all created equal and we build governments to protect our rights so that we can steer our own lives and try to then steer together to a shared safety and happiness, that sentence really captures that foundational, beautiful notion about human agency that lies at the kind of bedrock of democracy. So that's the golden apple, I want to say. And then the Constitution is the form of government, how to organize the powers of government, to hold those principles, that proposition about equality and freedom in place, to help us continuously, through our institutions and our practices, recognize equal human dignity as the anchor stone for our society. Now, that's all very abstract, and I'm sure you have lots of questions for me about it, and I hope you will ask me questions and help me clarify if I've been unclear about any of that. But there's something else I want to say about the golden apple, because the image is so beautiful and so powerful. I love it. But with my students, in addition to the power of the text, which they gave to me by just how quickly, again, it connected to their own efforts to change their lives, and they immediately started using it to think about, okay, well, here in my workplace, here's what's not working. How am I going to talk to my employer to make that better? Here in the city of Chicago, here's what's not working. How am I going to talk to my alderman or engage with the mayor to try to make things better? They immediately found their civic capacities growing. In addition to that effect of the text, though, there's another thing they shared with me. Many of my students had never encountered the Declaration of Independence before my class. This was astonishing to me. And it made me think that they had been robbed of their inheritance. This golden apple, imagine that I had an apple that was pure gold, all right? And I said, I can give you the golden apple, or I'm going to withhold the golden apple from you. My students, in other words, I felt that had been with the golden apple had been withheld from them. They hadn't been given the Declaration of Independence in their earlier schooling, in our culture, and the like. So why not? What was that withholding about? There are really two things I think that have led to that withholding of the golden apple, the withholding of our shared inheritance. One is a concern about the relationship between the founding and slavery. Another is a concern about the relationship between the founding and the place of women in American society. So I want to talk to both of those issues, which can keep people from taking the Declaration, seriously. So, for example, we'll say, well, but people will say, but Thomas Jefferson, wasn't he a hypocrite? I mean, held slaves, held people in bondage. He couldn't possibly have meant that language of equality. We should just dump the whole text because it was just, propaganda and sort of hypocritical. Well, so we have to take a closer look, actually. That is a real sort of, honestly, incomplete picture of the history of the text itself. I like to say there's a lot of things we can learn from Thomas Jefferson, and they include how to get credit for something, okay? So just keep that in mind. His tombstone says, author, Declaration of Independence. That's why we all think it was a solo project. So if you want credit for something, just know it, put it on your tombstone. Nothing in a democracy is ever a solo project. And the Declaration of Independence was not a solo project. It was the project of a committee. There were 5 people on the committee. Jefferson was the chair, yes, but the other people were John Adams from Massachusetts, who never held people in bondage. Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania. He had held people in bondage earlier in his life, but by 1776, he had repudiated the practice and was already actively working in favor of abolition. Then you had Roger Sherman from Connecticut and Robert Livingston from New York. And of those 5 men, it wasn't Thomas Jefferson who got Congress to the point of thinking about independence and then wanting to write a statement and preamble articulating the purpose of independence. It was John Adams from Massachusetts. John Adams and Richard Henry Lee from Virginia have been driving the politics all year, fall of 75, spring of 76. John Adams came back for the second session of Congress in February of 1776 with a to-do list. That to-do list had on it near the top that all the colonies were to assume their own governments. And indeed, they started writing constitutions that spring, even before July 4th. He had on his list that there needed to be treaties with France and Spain. And then the third to last item on his list, number 14, was Declaration of Independency. And it's John Adams, actually, who gave us the language about pursuit of happiness. All year long, 75 and 76, he was making a case for what the moral foundations of the society they were going to build could be. He argued in a pamphlet in April that the purpose of individual people is happiness in the same way that the purpose of government is happiness. Now, this is a really important phrase because when we get to the Declaration and we hear the phrase life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that phrase, pursuit of happiness, is replacing a term that was more conventional at the time. That was the term property, all right? The natural rights of the philosophers as articulated in the 17th century and early 18th century, the conventional list was life, liberty, and property. But by the spring of 1776, the right to property had already become closely entangled with the defense of slavery. And Adams wanted to keep that defense of slavery out of the Declaration of Independence. So we got life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's actually a pro-abolitionist moment in the Declaration of Independence. So, and indeed, so much so is it a pro-abolitionist moment that people used that language. In January of 1777, Free African American in Boston, Prince Hall, used it to submit a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly to end slavery in Massachusetts. It didn't succeed, but then that language got used in the Massachusetts state constitution. And then before the end of the Revolutionary War, on the basis of that constitution, slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. The same thing happened in Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin state. Also in Vermont. Vermont was its own country at the time, still kind of its own country, I think. So it doesn't count as one of the first states to have abolished slavery, but Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Vermont had all abolished enslavement before the end of the Revolutionary War, and they had done so on the basis of the language in the Declaration of Independence. So I share that story to say the Declaration was not a solo project. It was a committee of 5. Then it went to Congress. Congress cut 25% out and then passed it. It was an act of democratic writing. The document has Jefferson's voice in it, yes, and it has the voices of Adams and Benjamin Franklin. It has an anti-slavery voice in it as much as it had some pro-slavery voices in it. So that's a really important thing to know about the Declaration. And I think it helps people sort of open it up and think, okay, there were people who immediately took those principles of equality seriously and acted on them in a practical way. So that's one piece to keep in mind. A second piece is about the question of women. Where do women fit into the Declaration of Independence? And this is the League of Women Voters. So I know that this is an organization that has a long and deep understanding of the place of women in American politics and how that has changed over time. And of course, we owe so much to the hard work of the League and the predecessors of the League in the 19th century. So here, people often worry about the phrase, all men are created equal. And of course, when I recited that second sentence, I changed it to people. For us, the word man now does mean a gendered person, right? But in the 18th century, it was a genuinely universal word that meant humankind. We know that actually from the very draft of the Declaration of Independence itself. When the committee submitted their draft to Congress, I think it was around June 25th or so that they submitted the draft. When they submitted the draft, it had a passage in it that critiqued King George III for the slave trade. It critiqued him for violating the sacred rights of life and liberty of a distant people in Africa who had never done him any wrong. And it critiqued the markets where those men, and it's written in all caps, were bought and sold. Now, we know it wasn't just males who were bought and sold in those markets. It was women as well as men, children as well as adults. So that powerful passage critiquing slavery is actually really good evidence that indeed they did use the word man in a universal sense. So I do now say all people are created equal because that's what it takes for our ears to hear the universal claim. But they did indeed mean the universal claim. Now, if they meant the universal claim, if they meant equality, then why did they get stuck as they did in the patriarchal and dominating forms of political structure that they then used? Here, an exchange between Abigail Adams and John Adams is super interesting and really elucidates both what they got right and what they got wrong. So Abigail was remarkable, and I'm sure many of you know a lot about her. I mean, she was so learned, she was so smart, she was so witty, she wrote beautifully, and she was so eager for independence. She was very frustrated with how slow the men in Philadelphia were in terms of working their way up to declaring independence. She was always writing to John and saying, come on already, like what's taking you so long? What's going on with this? And so then by March and April 76, as they were getting closer to independence, she started asking more pointed questions. In particular, remember the ladies, she says, where are we in the new plans you're formulating for a new picture of this society? And interestingly, she's not the only person who asked that kind of question. John Adams also got questions about working people without property. Where did they fit in? And he got questions about free Blacks. Where would they fit in this new structure? And he gave the same shape of answer to everybody, including Abigail. He basically drew on the last clause of that long sentence I recited to you. So in that self-evident truth sentence, the last clause of it says that when government's not working, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and then to do two things: lay the foundation on principles and organize the powers of government in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. He took that distinction between the principles that it's based on and the form of government, and he said, for example, to Abigail, yes, those rights are for everybody. And so, yes, your security, your well-being, your happiness, that's part of what this society is going to deliver. But he said, with regard to the powers, how we organize the powers of a government, for that we will reserve, quote, our masculine system. We will retain, he said, our masculine system for organizing the powers of government. So he was explicit about that choice of a patriarchal structure. Now, as you might imagine, Abigail's response was, not so sure about that. She wrote back and she said, well, husbands have a history of tyranny. And when you give people power that's unchecked, it tends in a tyrannical direction. So she said, so wait, maybe we'll give you one more chance, but we women will not consider ourselves bound by laws in which we have no voice or representation. That was her phrase, no voice or representation. And she warned him, she said, I think we women may have to foment a rebellion to get voice and representation. It's an incredibly powerful letter. And what she's observing there is a very precise philosophical point. John had claimed that you can aim to protect the rights of all while reserving power only to some. And Abigail said back, no, that's impossible because absolute power corrupts. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you are going to protect the rights of all, you're going to have to give voice and representation. You're going to have to give power to all. And so that's really been the project then of the American people ever since, is this question of can we in fact learn how to share power across all the different categories of people that we are in this society so that we can also protect the rights of all. Now, they obviously made a mistake at that critical moment, although it's interesting, people often don't know that women did have the right to vote in several states at the time of the revolution. And that right to vote didn't fully disappear until 1807. New Jersey was the last state to end women's right to vote. So regaining the right to vote was the important story of the 19th and early 20th century. But there was this window at the time of the revolution where women and free Blacks actually, in some places, had the right to vote. Now, I go through all of that history in order to help you see the way in which the Declaration of Independence itself had principles in it that people did understand in their full force right from the beginning. And to some extent, that full force was even already beginning to be exercised with the early abolition of slavery in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. And in other cases, with regard to women, it was being named that the execution, the institutions that were following from the principles were too limited in their form and that this was going to cause problems for the new nation. So where does that leave us now as we start to think about our own situation and the health of our own democracy? Can the Declaration of Independence still guide us? Here, I think the easiest answer, the best answer, is actually to use Lincoln as an example. Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address is basically using the Declaration of Independence himself to analyze the state of affairs in his own time and place. As you all know, he stands there to give the oration a few months after a terrible battle that had left thousands of bodies strewn across the battlefield, the worst casualties of the Civil War, a genuine human catastrophe. And he's there to help dedicate the field. And he says, of course, we cannot dedicate it any more than those men who lost their lives have already dedicated it with their greatest sacrifice. But so what we have to do is rededicate ourselves, he says, to the proposition that all men are created equal. And then at the very end of the speech, he gives us an interpretation of that key proposition, which is, from my point of view, the most profound way of and fastest interpretation of the Declaration of Independence that anybody has ever offered. He says, to dedicate ourselves to this proposition that all people are created equal means that we are working to ensure that never will perish from this earth a government that is of the people, by the people, for the people. And it's those last two clauses, by the people, for the people, that capture the heart of the Declaration. What Lincoln is saying is that a government will be for the people when it is by the people. So when you look around, if you ask yourself, okay, is the government for the people? That's where you have to start. Are we actually seeing a society that's working for the people? And then we recognize we're hearing so many expressions of complaint and frustration around issues of housing, around issues of mobility and opportunity, around issues of prices, around issues of healthcare, around issues of childcare, around issues of the effects of social media on our kids and the way in which technology is taking over our lives. We have many voices from all sides of the political spectrum rising up and saying, right now, government is not for the people. And so for Lincoln, that's the first thing you evaluate, is government for the people? And if you find that it's perhaps not for the people, and I think many would right now say it's not really for the people, then the next question is, well, is it by the people? Because if it's not by the people, then that's why it's not for the people. And when we look around at our political institutions right now, and we consider gerrymandering, for example, which you've just experienced, and low turnout primaries and closed party primaries and the like, we put all that stuff together, and the effect it's actually having is to me that 60 million Americans no longer have a meaningful vote in federal elections. That is a quarter of the electorate. That means we do not have government by the people right now in the United States. And so then you step back from that recognition and you have to say, well, no wonder we don't have government for the people. It is not government by the people. And suddenly then a whole window of needed reforms opens up, changes that we need to achieve in order to have government for the people because it is by the people. And so just as I come to my close here to share with you some of those kinds of reforms, what are the things that would give us a government that was genuinely for the people? Well, for starters, I think we need to get rid of party primaries and replace them with what is called an all-party primary. That's when on your primary ballot, everybody gets the same ballot. There's no D ballot and R ballot, for example. You get one ballot. All the candidates are there. All the voters see all the candidates all the time. And all the candidates always have to face all the voters. This way you have competitive elections at all points. And then the real decision is made in the general election. That's the biggest electorate, right? The primary electorate's a smaller electorate. People don't turn out for primaries. The big election is the general election, and so you want the general electorate to be the decisive vote. So all party primaries instead of conventional party primaries would be one piece of the change. A federal law to ban gerrymandering would be another possible piece of the change. Or there's a great bill in Congress called the Fair Representation Act, which is working on achieving proportional representation. And we can talk more about that in its details. That too would be one that would bring people back into our political system. There is a terrific constitutional amendment on the move. This is called the For the People Amendment. It is to undo the effects of Citizens United and to establish that corporations do not count as persons for the sake of considering political speech. The good news on that is that the organization moving it forward has now achieved resolutions through the state legislatures in 25 states to call on Congress to introduce this amendment. They have to get up to 2/3 of the states, but they're at a half already. They're on the march. And the two most recent states to vote for this resolution were Oklahoma and Idaho. And the Oklahoma state legislature voted unanimously in favor of this resolution. So that For the People amendment would take power out of the hands of corporations and the way in which money is flowing into our politics and put it back in the hands of the people, for instance. So that's just an initial sort of starter set of reforms that would give us government by the people. And my proposition, Lincoln's proposition to you, is that when we have government by the people, we will actually restore government for the people. So that is what I want to give you. In other words, is my account of how the Declaration continues to be useful. And so the account I'm giving you is that the heart of the Declaration is the golden apple. I'll repeat it again in a second here so you can take it into your spirit and mull on it and reflect on it. But if you want a shortcut to understanding the golden apple, the shortcut is Lincoln's phrase, by the people, for the people. All right. And then that beautiful shortcut is a just perfect analytical frame for analyzing politics at any moment in our history. It was a great frame for Lincoln at Gettysburg. It was a great frame for us now in 2026. And indeed, when we use that frame, we find solutions to the problems that we are currently facing in our political moment. So because so much comes from the golden apple, all right, because it's the word fitly spoken in the frame of silver, which is the Constitution, I want to give it to you one more time, just in the hopes that, I'm just tossing you your inheritance, right? I'm tossing you a golden apple here through the screen so you can enjoy your inheritance. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Happy Fourth.
Wonderful. Thank you. There's a question which I think you sort of partially answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's from Rebecca, who says she's a big fan of yours. This question may or not be in your wheelhouse. I am curious about what constitutional changes you think would help eliminate the hold of oligarchs on our government, environment, market controls, etc. And
Yeah,
and I think you sort of answered that, but maybe you'd like to expand a little bit.
sure. And I appreciate that. Yes. I mean, for me, the number one constitutional change that we need is that amendment that I mentioned, the For the People Amendment, to change the parameters around campaign finance and to empower us to control the flows of money in politics. There are other changes that have what I would call constitutional level impacts that don't require changes to the Constitution to affect them. So, for example, I think Supreme Court justices should have term limits. That actually can be done as a matter of legislation. It doesn't require a constitutional change. They can be given 18-year terms on the Supreme Court so that after 18 years, they rotate off to another place in the federal bench, which is how you maintain their having a lifetime appointment to the federal bench. You don't have to change that to get term limits on the Supreme Court. Relatedly, I also think that we need to increase the size of the House of Representatives to solve the problem of the broken electoral college. And increasing the size of the House of Representatives also is just a matter of law. We just need need Congress to pass a law to lift the cap. They passed a law to freeze the cap in 1925-ish or so, roughly speaking. And we need a new law on that subject.
What about abolishing the Electoral College?
Yeah, it's funny. I know a lot of people like that, and it's certainly one important option to consider as a way to solve the problem of the Electoral College. I myself have not been, so I don't, for me, it's not the right path forward to a solution, both for substantive reasons and for reasons of feasibility. So, on a substantive point, the Electoral College would not be sort of out of whack with the popular vote if the size of the House of Representatives were continuously growing with the population. The size of the Electoral College is built out of the combination of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so it's the fact that the House got frozen 100 years ago that has produced this fact that we can more frequently get the popular vote and the Electoral College vote going different directions. But the reason that I don't myself think that a switch to a purely popular vote is helpful is because I do think that we are still a network of states, and the states have different cultures and experiences, and that it's important that smaller states get attention. And the Electoral College does help give them a bit more protection than they would have with a purely popular vote. This also is one that splits along purely partisan lines. Democrats are in favor of abolishing the Electoral College, and Republicans are not. And most major reforms have to find a way to be cross-partisan. So, and increasing the size of the House does actually have cross-partisan support. So it's a solution that, from my point of view, also has more feasibility than the abolishing the Electoral College path does.
Okay, thank you. Are there any politicians who are actually working on any of the things you have suggested?
Yes, there absolutely are. So the increasing the size of the House of Representatives has been introduced in several bills. And I'm going to be embarrassed to now not remember the names of the specific congressmen who've done that. One was from Illinois. There's another, I believe, from Washington State. So that is percolating in Congress. The Fair Representation Act is introduced by a Virginian congressman named Don Beyer, with co-sponsor as his sort of immediate second sponsor, Jamie Raskin, whom I'm sure you all know from Maryland. So those are key bills, absolutely, that are people have been working on and are moving forward. I think that the Fair Representation Act actually might have legs under it sooner rather than later. The impacts of the Calais Supreme Court decision, for example, which got out of the Voting Rights Act, mean we need alternative ways of ensuring that racial minorities as well as ideological minorities are fairly represented in Congress, and the Fair Representation Act would achieve that. So I think there's likely to be energy around that. Um,
Great. Do you have any thoughts on the best way to address the unitary executive?
yes, I most certainly do. No, thank you for asking. Gosh, this is such an important question. Um, so I also just want to say, so I have a new book that just came out a couple of weeks ago called Radical Duke: How One Aristocrat and the American Revolution Transformed Britain. And it's actually about British politics, but it's about the kind of relationship between America and Britain in the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s. But the interesting thing about the story is, like, the way we usually tell the story of the revolution is that here were the American colonists, and there was sort of terrible Britain over there, just like America versus Britain. But the actual story is that the king in England was concentrating power. He was basically producing a unitary executive. He was diminishing parliament and consolidating control under himself in a variety of ways. And then people were complaining in London and publishing criticism, and he was throwing them into prison for sedition and things like that. And so there were radicals in England who were complaining about the king, and at the same time that the colonists in America were complaining about the king. And in both places, the colonies in Britain, the complaints were exactly this: the problem of an overreaching executive, excessive concentration of power in the executive. So both in the colonies and in Britain, what they knew they wanted instead was what they called legislative supremacy, right? The idea that the legislature is the voice of the people. The legislature needs to set the steering direction for the society. When you have a legislature doing that, what you have is a process to synthesize the many different interests and points of view of a population, the sausage making process, right? What comes out at the end of the sausage making process doesn't look like what anybody put in. It's like everybody gets to be a little bit grumpy, but nobody has to have somebody else's complete solitary will imposed on them. When you have an executive and they can impose their will, then everybody just has that experience of imposition and whiplash as the arbitrary will of the executive kind of unfolds. So legislative supremacy was the sort of number one goal of the colonists and the radicals in the 18th century. In America, we pursued that goal by having a revolution, writing a constitution, and making Congress Article 1, right? The first branch of the Constitution. In Britain, they thought about a revolution. They got closer to a revolution than people have realized. In the end, they decided not to, and they pursued this project of reform. And they focused on exactly two things: fight corruption and broaden the suffrage. The bigger the electorate, the more real the competition in elections, the harder it is for somebody like a king to consolidate power and control things. And ditto, if you can get rid of slush funds and patronage and stipends and things like that, that diminishes that power of the king. So that's what they did for 50 years: fight corruption and broaden the suffrage. What's the result? Well, they've got Charles III and we've got Donald Trump. So I ask you, which country has the more restrained executive? Okay, so there are some things we can learn from that British pathway of reform that I think would be quite helpful for us. So fighting corruption, we need an anti-corruption package for Congress that gets control of the executive again, and also does things like ban stock trading in the legislature, a whole slew of things. The money and politics stuff is a part of that as well. And then broaden the suffrage. That's some of those reforms around, for example, getting rid of party primaries and getting rid of the gerrymandering problem with all party primaries. That gives the decision back to the big electorate, and that actually diminishes the power of that unitary executive.
Susan asked a question about what the League is doing. We're involved in a lot of these issues, and we just came back from our national convention, and we don't have time right now to go through it. Debbie, is there anything that you want to offer about the League before I move on to other questions? Because
Um, yeah, I would like to add just one thing, which is that in the current environment that we're in, we're seeing more and more energy by the National League and frankly by state leagues as well, going through the court system. And this is not by choice that we selected that as the avenue for change. And as we all know, it has mixed results. And it's a long, slow process to go through a court system, and sometimes we end up with moments of frustration about it. So, but we keep slugging on. Right now, the state league is involved in a lawsuit over redistricting. So, hope we
Got
have
it.
good news soon.
Good for you. Thank you for your leadership on that. It is really important, and we do need litigation as one of our critical tools, right? This is a toolkit with many tools in it. What we need really is to be able to share with each other what our work is, so that we can all be, rowing in the same direction, and make sure that the litigation strategies and the ballot initiative strategies and the electoral strategies and the federal legislation strategies kind of line up with each other. So that, I think, is the work of the moment.
Yeah.
Great.
And I would be remiss if I didn't also add that we are continually working, on voter engagement, and our disappointment is always how many people feel that it's not of value to them and don't choose to vote. So we're always looking for new ideas. So if you have great ideas on how to do that, we'd love to hear that.
Well, I'll just share. I mean, I'm working on a ballot initiative in Massachusetts right now for an all-party primary, and I don't know I think Tennessee is not a ballot initiative state, probably. So for you, it would have to be a different kind of pathway or course. But one of the reasons I got going on this was because I spent 2020, 2021 doing a lot of visiting and listening with people around Massachusetts about their political experience. And I remember this one occasion I visited a church in Springfield in Western Mass, which is a relatively speaking poorer city. It's our third largest city, and it's economically disadvantaged city. And powerful church service, sort of evangelical Black church. So, I mean, the power of the church. And afterwards, there was a community meeting. Lots of people stayed, and lots of intense conversation about problems like asthma. It's got the worst asthma rates in the state, coming from pollution, policing issues, schools, you name it. People also had really good ideas for solutions. And then I asked if they were going to vote in the upcoming election, and I was stunned by how many people said no. Yeah. And to your point, I mean, these were highly engaged, highly informed people, but they were not planning to vote. So I asked them why, and their answer was just straightforward. No choices on the ballot. Mm-hmm. Or if there are choices, the choices are essentially meaningless. There's not any real choice between the candidates. And sure enough, I mean, this may not be your situation, but in Massachusetts, I followed up on that with research. We do literally have the fewest contested elections of any state in the country. So, the last decade, half of our elections have had one candidate in them. So they're actually quite right and quite rational to say it's like not worth my time to get time off work or figure out childcare to go vote. So anyway, I say all that only to say that I do a lot of civic education too. And same thing with sort of kids. I found myself, I couldn't quite just tell them to kind of go vote and get ready to engage, because I had come to see how irrational our election system is. It's like the people who are saying like they don't want to vote because it's not worth their time or not of value to them, like they're kind of right. And so that's why, for me, I've ended up feeling I have to put so much energy and time into trying to shift how the election system operates so that it is actually worth people's time. And that we can, and I think that in itself will change the incentives that you're struggling upstream against.
Thank you. Here's a different question from Joy. Will you share about your Educating for American Democracy project and some of its successes?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. It's nice to sort of pivot to good news, right? We've been talking about a lot of the hard things. So I mentioned, my teaching experience with the Declaration of Independence, and that really initiated kind of lifetime of working on civic education for me. Again, because I had discovered my students had this material withheld from them. And so it kind of turned into a bit of a mission to try to get civic education back into school so that wouldn't be true anymore. And that resulted in a big coalition working on something called Educating for American Democracy. I will put the link in the chat in a second. And this is a national coalitional effort that produced a framework for excellence in history and civic learning, which we released in 2021. We were funded by both the first Trump and the Biden administration. The point of that being, we built, a huge coalition that was diverse in every dimension: scholarly expertise, professional background, geography, demographic background, and viewpoint. And we did that because our belief was that polarization has been the single biggest obstacle to actually rebuilding civic learning infrastructure. And so we wanted to break through polarization. So we did, and there are pilots using this framework in 19 states around the country, and a real, sort of beginning of a renaissance in civic learning. And, it is also the case, interestingly, that over the last 10 years, the American public is relearning its basic sort of civic understanding. Some of that's project-based learning, like thanks to President Trump, we have all had to learn about things like impeachment process and which branch has which rights and so forth. So a decade ago, 1 in 4 Americans could name the 3 branches of government, and we're back up to 70%. So we're moving in the right direction. And I do think that kind of knowledge is fundamental to, are we able to secure the health of our democracy?
Let's see. Thank you. Erwin asks, with respect to executive power, David French suggests a constitutional amendment that would revise the language of Article 2 to provide that the president shall have the power to execute laws enacted by Congress.
Yeah, I think that's another great suggestion for a constitutional change that would be beneficial to us and that would explicitly, clarify the fact that legislative supremacy is the structure that is intended in the Constitution. So thank you for that. I would agree.
I have a pretty broad question. What do you think is most misunderstood about the Declaration of Independence?
Great question. I guess I might ask that question back a little, and maybe if you have further thoughts. I mean, I tend to think the thing that is most misunderstood is this kind of belief that the Declaration of Thomas Jefferson should be understood as like perfectly synonymous with each other. That to understand the Declaration, all you have to do is think about who Thomas Jefferson was. Whereas, it was by a committee. It did have abolitionists working on it, as well as having people who held slaves working on it, et cetera. And so I think because of that collapse between the Declaration and Jefferson, it does lead people to consider the all people are created equal proposition as just like flowery language without real meaning. In fact, it did have real meaning. And so that's sort of my, you can tell I'm a kind of missionary here. I'm sort of like trying to go ahead and get that word out, that proposition that all people are created equal has real meaning. It has immediate consequence in the politics of the time. And it has been a powerful engine for the good that this country has achieved over its 250 years.
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any other questions, but I want to just make sure that nobody has any additional questions for our wonderful guest. All right. In that case, I'm just going to ask everyone in their own way to offer you applause and gratitude. This has been fascinating and very uplifting in these
Good.
times. So thank
Great.
you.
Well, thank you for all of your great work. The League has always led the way, and you are leading the way again. So thank you for staying the course. We're all grateful to you. So
Thank you, everyone, and have
have a great
great 4th of
holiday.
July and
Happy
celebrate our
4th.
independence.
Exactly. Take good care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, I think it's just us now.
Yeah, I'm just putting last people in the waiting room.
Yeah.
So just a second, and I'll be done with that. Okay. Now it's just us.
Yeah, it's just us. Well, that was very nice. So thank you for
Yeah.
watching that. She was very, very good.
Oh yeah, and her it's actually you can find YouTube videos of her that are they're even more exciting because it's in a anyway, I just encourage you. And I'm sure her books are good. I've not read one,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
probably should.
Now that was
Um,
very good, and that was a good turnout. It was people
almost
kind
40.
of go. It was 40. It was
Oh, okay,
so
good.
so
We
it was
got
great.
40.
Yeah.
Good, good. Yeah. And I guess we should maybe there's some opportunity to participate or partner on the Educating for American Democracy project. And she had a couple of recommendations on things to do that I was not familiar with.
Well,
I
it was
yeah.
interesting the priorities. I thought that was really interesting.
What do you
Um,
mean?
to that she felt like expanding the
Oh yeah.
legislature was more important than which is interesting. I mean, I wouldn't have
I know, I never thought about that one. We've
I
never talked about it.
I had that as a pretty low,
Yeah.
low hanging fruit on that one. Okay. Anyway, that was interesting. Yeah, no, I
Yeah, it
thought
was good.
it
It was good.
was
Okay.
okay,
Well,
well, good.
I'll just as usual, I did the recording wrong, it looks like, but that's okay.
Figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just post that and enjoy your holiday.
You too. Okay.
Okay. Good
Bye.
night.